Hello, my name is Reese Perez, and I am a fourth-year clinical psychology student in the class Psych 181, Drugs and Behavior, and this is my first reflection in which I watched the movie documentary Brain Transplant. The documentary followed 6 patients, to which they all came in under the circumstances of having a sudden onset of complete catatonia. All of them were unable to move, unable to speak, and were unable to communicate as to what happened. Some of which were found with family, some of which were brought to the hospital, all of them were brought to the hospital, and they were under oversight for several days without moving, and all of the clinicians who were providing them care did not have any clue as to what was going on with them. After a few days, one of the patients was able to regain mobility in his hand, to which the clinicians providing him care had handed him a notebook and a pencil and explained, please, if you can communicate what is going on. And the patient had responded saying that he had the full capability of moving and he wants to move, but he cannot know what's happening. He said that it wasn't coming out right, his motor movements. He had the idea to know what he wanted to do, but it was not being executed. So they had been asking him several days of probing questions and trying to get a sort of sense of what was going on. And then the clinicians had asked him, did you take anything medication-wise? And the patient had then responded and said, which the researchers were completely shocked to hear, that he had ingested heroin. Then, after going through all the other cases to what was going on, the ones that all showed the exact same symptoms, they had all responded or indicated that they had taken heroin right before the onset of catatonia, which provided them a lead. And so they had unknowingly ingested a designer drug that is similar to the effects of heroin called MPPP. It was marketed and sold exactly for same price, same style. It was a designer drug that wasn't heroin, is what they ingested. However, the person that was synthesizing the designer drug had rushed the synthesis process of MPPP and had unknowingly and mistakenly synthesized alongside MPPP, had synthesized a chemical compound that is very similar to an herbicide chemical agent called MPTP, to which this chemical absolutely wrecked their body. Once they had ingested it, it had passed through every single other brain structure in their body, except for it had culminated in the substantia nigra. The substantia nigra is one of the main regions in your brain that creates dopamine, especially when it comes to movement and motor movement, which is also the hallmark neurological symptom or neurological finding with those with Parkinson's disease. Parkinson's disease is categorized as the substantia nigra isn't creating dopamine and isn't getting sent through the movement pathway in the brain, because in order to execute movement, you would need dopamine to be able to have any sort of rewarding behavior, such as movement. And under more close observations, they had realized that every single patient was basically going through a sort of artificially induced Parkinson's disease, to where they all showed the same symptoms of having, tremors and the shuffled gait and the cogwheel rigidity, and all of them were showing the signs of Parkinson's being fully developed, but it was an onset way before the age that all of these patients, if they were going to develop Parkinson's, way before this was going to happen. Parkinson's normally develops when you're in your 60s, and none of these patients that had come in catatonic had been anywhere around the age of 60. So this was just obviously a very, very tragic thing to happen to these 6 patients. However, this did provide some sort of benefit when it comes to medicine and research, in the fact that researchers saw that, if this chemical MPTP basically creates an artificial version of PD, it can be manipulated in a study and being able to be used to see the effects of PD, or just measure, or like just to experimentally manipulate PD, essentially, to be able to find a cure, to be able to see how it works, to be able to use non-human models. Like that was the main benefit, despite having a huge impact on these 6 people's lives. Immensely tragic. But so basically when they found out that, they were like, okay, so these patients are essentially under a form of mock Parkinson's, so maybe we should use the same treatment to what we normally treat Parkinson's, like people with Parkinson's disease, which is L-DOPA. L-DOPA is a naturally occurring chemical in your brain that's the precursor to dopamine. So because PD patients are unable to make dopamine, they get prescribed L-DOPA so they can have a source of dopamine in their brain. And all 6 patients went under L-DOPA treatment, and all of them showed astounding results for the first 1 to 2 years. All of them had gone from completely catatonic to be able to move, walk around, speak a little bit, and all of them were able to move around. And, the researchers said that the results that they saw were miraculous. So things went by as planned. People had continued their L-DOPA treatment, and all the effects are working until about 1 to 2 years. So the effects of L-DOPA, because it is essentially creating dopamine in your brain, what happens when there's too much dopamine in your brain, you can get a lot of adverse positive side effects, and some of the participants had already been seen to, especially Connie, one of the patients that we follow in this study, when she had first come in to the hospital under catatonia, a lot of people had thought she was catatonic schizophrenic, and they were like, she'll move out of it, whatever. However, what happens when there's too much, which is also seen in schizophrenic patients, when there's too much dopamine, you can have a lot of adverse positive side effects. So what all these patients experienced after 1 to 2 years of going through L-DOPA treatment, they had all experienced an extreme amount of movement that they were unable to control. So lots of jerky, like, what is it? One of the other subjects that we follow, Juanita, she was, rocking back in her chair, moving her arms violently, and like kicking her legs, and was unable to stop, which is a very debilitating thing, because although, like, yes, these are like not your voluntary movements, they're still using energy in your body, which is just, imagine dancing for 30 minutes and being unable to stop. Like, that's a very hard thing to live with. And also another one, particularly George Carrillo, who was also in one of the patients, he started to, and alongside all of the patients had experienced either, one of the following symptoms when it comes to an over excessive L-DOPA. But Carrillo was, he had been experiencing extreme hallucinations, and were very, very, terrifying hallucinations. He said he had constant hallucinations whenever he was taking L-DOPA after the 1 to 2 years, to where he was just seeing snakes, seeing fire, just seeing things that were just horrifying. And Connie, I believe last name Sands, she was also, she had been experiencing these hallucinations so horribly to where it was like unbearable. She would rather be catatonic, to where she would stop having the L-DOPA. So obviously L-DOPA was not a great treatment plan for these people, because, some of them opted out of L-DOPA treatment, saying that living with Parkinson's was better than living with L-DOPA. So, that's when we started going on that's when all these patients were then deferred to start going through more experimental treatments to be able to, somehow be able to reverse the thing that happened to them. And I had mentioned earlier that because of the discovery of MPTP, we were able to experimentally manipulate the side effects or the onset, or just be able to manipulate PD in general in a lab. So using primate models, there was a study that went on to where they took the progenitor cells from a fetal primate after inducing what is going to be a recipient or host primate. They had induced that primate with MPTP, and then started to have they basically just manipulated the onset of PD in that primate. So that primate was, showing tremors, shuffled gating, rigidity, just having a bunch of motor issues. And then they had thought, okay, so what if we take cells from a fetal primate, from the substantia nigra, to be able to be transplanted into their substantia nigra to see if the cells would be rejected, to see if they would start producing dopamine, to see if they would adjust to their environment and there wouldn't be any issues with it. After the transplantation occurred, the monkey was completely fine, starting to groom its tail, started to, show no symptoms of PD. And this, however, was, the findings for this was, it showed a lot of promise in having, treatment to these frozen addicts and having treatment to people with PD, suffering from PD in general. However, obviously, because we're humans and, we would need human stem cells to be able to do this from fetuses, which would normally come from aborted fetuses. This study was obviously very controversial. Lots of people were up in arms about how this was unethical and how, this is just furthering. A lot of pro-life people were very upset about this and thought that it should not continue. So then the study had to get set up to the National Institute of the people in the government to where that control, is this ethical? Is this going to work? Is this a viable study? And it got approved. However, the government did not let this happen due to an immense amount of backlash, which was obviously very disheartening for the researchers that were providing care for these subjects as they were undergoing, some of them were continuing their L-DOPA treatment, some of them had ceased off of it and were left completely catatonic for years. But there's a lot less stigma around stem cell research in Sweden. So a lot of Swedish collaborators had been in talks with the people who were involved with studying these 6 frozen addicts, and had decided under much consideration that they would take 2 subjects to be able to test this theory to see if it would work, to take stem cells from a human fetus from their substantia nigra to be implanted into the frozen addict's substantia nigra to see if it would start creating dopamine again. These 2 subjects were George Carrillo and Juanita Lopez, and they chose... George Carrillo had gone back to prison after his treatment with L-DOPA, just due to, sadly, when it comes to drugs, a lot of people resort to crime to be able to, to be able to afford their habit. And unfortunately, he had seized up in the middle of a robbery, and then, as he was leaving the fence to with the money, when they had called the police, he was already frozen there, and they grabbed him and then arrested him. So he was in prison when this happened, and they had pulled him out. And then because of his, he was a medical star because of his rare condition, and also the fact that he provided a lot of evidence for the cure for PD. And so they started the operation. The operation went successfully, and he was in recovery, and it took several years for him to for the procedure to show any effects, despite having initial success after the stem cells had been transplanted. They didn't get rejected in the brain, and they were acclimating to their new environment. It took about 1 to 2 years, and miraculous results. He had started moving, he had started walking, talking, being able to have full agency and control of himself. And then it was Juanita's turn. Same results. The same results with her going from completely catatonic or going in with the L-DOPA treatment, and just her, having all these adverse positive side effects. She had experienced the same results. And this provided this was acclaimed medically, showing that there is possibility to where that, although these results haven't been replicated in those who have developed Parkinson's disease naturally, meaning they didn't take MPTP and they had just, started to develop Parkinson's as they age. These results haven't been as replicated, according to the documentary, have not been replicated to the same rate. I think there's more recent research that backs this, like now is showing that there is very promising results, but still has not been fully proven. But it gave a lot of hope, and it probably provided them a lot of context to be able to have the results that we do today. It provided them with a lot of information in doing so. And as for comparing the treatments between L-DOPA and the brain transplant, I'm pretty sure that it's pretty obvious that the brain transplant was much better for just treatment long term in general when it comes to MPTP, the frozen addicts who had ingested it, because there were no adverse side effects. Like they were, obviously there was a little bit of, they weren't completely back to where they were pre-drug administration, but it was miles better than how they had normally been living. Compared to when they were taking L-DOPA, and some of them had to stop treatment because it was so adverse to them, or some of them were continuing to deal with it, but it was just still not a great quality of life because of all these adverse side effects. Like, they were experiencing these terrifying hallucinations and not being able to control their motor movements, or they were living with catatonia. So overwhelmingly, I believe that the brain transplant treatment was much better. And I am just like, I was astounded when I saw those results. I thought it was incredible. One of my main questions though, not one of my main questions. I guess it kind of it borders between being my main question and also my standout is, although I'm looking at this from a 2026 viewpoint and not in the 1980s when this was happening in America, I was really surprised to see such an adverse reaction from people because of abortion. Obviously, abortion is whether saying is a good or a bad thing it's subjective, but I'm fully pro-choice, and I think that people should have the right to do with their own bodies, but also the fact that I think using the tissue from fetuses that they were aborted, so they were either going to be buried or just wasted, essentially, the stem cells that could be used to cure one of the most debilitating neurological diseases. I was dumbfounded. Obviously, I would think that there would be some sort of exception to where people would see these results and be like, wow, this is incredible. This could, this very sad, tragic thing that happens that people should still have the right to be able to do, could provide a lot of good for people who have been debilitated by an awful, awful neurological disease. And I guess my main question, which is kind of a segue from this, is I really don't understand as to why people thought it would be better to be wasteful than to be able to use, material that was the outcome of an abortion to be able to help one of the most debilitating neurological diseases that affects such a wide variety of people, such a wide population of people. And yeah, that's my main question. I'm just I don't understand why waste some things that can come from a very tragic and hard experience to be able to help others being able to go through their tragic and hard experience with living with an incredibly debilitating disease when there's no other, cure or treatment options aside from L-DOPA, which already has a plethora of things to, consider and just live with. And some people end up not using it because it's so variable in results, and also just variable in quality of life dependent on the person who's experiencing it. But overall, I was really, really impressed with this documentary, and I thought it was a very, very good watch, and I thought it was, it just gives me hope that neuroscience will be able to continue to develop to where that we can eventually, this very debilitating neurological disease will be a thing of the past. But that was my reflection for this class, and thank you so much for watching.